And you can get the false impression that Matthew is a kind of main gospel, and then Mark is a cut down version, like a synopsis or something, a short version of it. And actually, the opposite is the case, and even more. Mark wrote first, 16 chapters. Matthew overwrites Mark. Yes, he does incorporate roughly 90% or so, maybe more, of Mark. But the question is, how does he incorporate it? What does he do when he pulls something in? And time again, we find that he is unhappy with Mark. He changes Mark. And Luke does the same thing. Another example would be when Peter confesses Jesus finally as the Christ. In Mark, it's very climactic. It's in chapter 8. And then Jesus starts talking about his suffering, and Peter rebukes him. And then Jesus rebukes Peter and says, "Get behind me, Satan." And so you've got this idea that Peter's confession, although the words are right, "You are the Christ," he doesn't have the understanding. And then 3 other times in Mark, as Jesus talks about who he is and what's going to happen, particularly his suffering, the disciples are asking things like, but who will be on the right and left hand when we have glory? And who will really reign? And who will really be the first? And who is the greatest? And so forth. So it actually shows that Peter's confession is without understanding. I would say it's a false confession, because if you say a word and don't understand what it means, then the confession is not really valid, meaning your understanding of it is invalid. And that's the case in Mark. Well, Matthew's not going to let that stand. Luke, by the way, just takes it out. He takes out the whole thing. It's just gone. Take a look. You're reading along in Mark, and if you look at the parallel in Luke, he's like, yeah, all this stuff about calling Peter Satan and saying he's wrong, get rid of that. In fact, Luke takes the failure of the disciples out throughout his gospel. You know, the shortest verse in Mark, and it's very chilling, is when Jesus is arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane. And Mark says one verse short, and they all forsook him and fled, talking about the apostles. Luke just takes that out. So back to the confession of Peter, Luke just takes it out. But what does Matthew do? He adds a blessing of Peter. He keeps the dispute about "get behind me, Satan" in the rebuke, but then he adds the blessing of Peter. You are Peter, and you've made a right confession, and I'm going to build the church on this. So do you see how he is very troubled by the way Mark stands as it is? So it's not a matter of harmonizing, it's a matter of rewriting and overwriting. I'm not just trying to destroy anybody's faith here, and people can read these texts as they want, but you should read them carefully. Critically means carefully. To read carefully, see what Mark says, see how Matthew uses his source Mark, see how Luke uses his source Mark, and what their interests and concerns are. And you're going to find that what they do repeatedly. A final example, and there's so many more in the course, but it's in Mark 10, where Jesus is asked, "What do I do to inherit eternal life?" And he's called good rabbi, good teacher. And Jesus rebukes the man and says, "Why are you calling me good? There's only one good God." Mark is very big on the one God, Shema. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one." Jesus quotes that and commends a scribe for recognizing that if you love God, the one God, and love your neighbor as yourself, that's more than all the burnt offerings and sacrifices of the temple. And there's a lot more on that as we go through Mark in the course to show that's one of the motifs of Mark. Well, Matthew just takes that out. He basically says, "Why do you ask me about the good?" Well, come on. The text is, "Why do you call me good? There's one good God." That's just gone. So you find this all the way through. And I really encourage my students, and if you take this course, you're going to be my student in that sense, to just do a careful reading of these materials. A critical, careful reading so that you really know what each one says You try to analyze and understand why we have overwritten versions of Mark in Matthew and further in Luke, and what's going on here and what the issues are. This is really how to study Christian origins and to deal with the texts that we have.